Hey everybody, it's Julie. If you've seen some of my other videos, you've probably noticed that I like to give advice to querying authors who are trying to get a literary agent. And one of my videos gave a pretty comprehensive understanding of how to write query letters and also how to find literary agents to send them to. But I haven't really gone into a whole lot of detail about some of the do-nots, some of the mistakes that many beginning authors make. So, one thing that I've done this year and last year, I participated as a mentor in the Pitch Wars contest, which was all querying authors trying to get their literary agents. And we, the mentors, picked authors who had entered the contest to help them with their querying materials and help them sometimes with their opening paragraphs, their beginning chapters, to help them present themselves best to the literary agents and try to get representation. And I got tons of applications this year when I participated as a mentor. I got over 100 of them, and last year it was more than 70, so I've seen a lot of query letters, and I've seen a lot of the same mistakes coming up in them both years and over again. So when I offered my feedback to those authors, I found myself typing a lot of the same things over and over again. And I thought I would make a video about those things that I would see so often, so that those of you who are my subscribers and my viewers don't end up making those same mistakes in your query letters. So definitely the number one problem that I saw in the query letters was lack of trajectory. What I would see is people just kind of telling you stuff that happens to their characters, or giving you stuff that was a little bit too vague or maybe a little bit too detailed on the other end, but they don't give you like the big picture of where the story goes, how it begins, what are the problems, and what are the characters trying to accomplish, what's in their way, what are the stakes. These queries really needed to be a lot tighter than they were for the most part, and they needed to have a single direction. There are some books that doesn't accurately represent what happens in the books, but that's okay, because a query letter is primarily designed for the agent to get the basic idea of maybe your major plot point, and decide if they want to see more. You don't have to talk about all the side plots, you don't have to include even all of the major characters if you have many. You just have to give a general idea, and yes, you may be having to simplify some of your story, or you may be having to leave out some really important stuff to make it seem like a really tight, straightforward story that we want to tune in to see. So remember trajectory when you're explaining what your book is about. You need to make it as plot-centered as you can, and you need to let us know what the characters want, how they're going to go about getting it, and not just rattle it off as a list of what happens in what order. So besides that first main complaint that I had, here are just a few others. I saw several query letters with too much detail. They told me things that I really didn't need to know for the big picture, and it usually made the query a little bit too long. It made it kind of boring and bogged down with details, and you really need to just make sure to prune the query so that it's got the right amount of detail, not too much, not too little. Another one that I saw too often in the queries was attempting to insert storytelling into the query itself. And it's okay if you have a little bit of voice going on, if you get the atmosphere of your story through in the storytelling that you choose in your query, but you don't want to start telling us about a scene. You don't want to start describing as if we're reading the book yet. You do need to back up a little bit and give us the wide shot, not the opening scene. Another one I saw too much of was queriers presenting the final stakes of their story as a question. It would sound usually something like, can she save her mother in time? Well, usually in stories like this the answer is yes, so if that's the only reason that I would tune in to read the story, I probably don't need to read it now. You can be more creative with those dramatic questions if you turn them into statements like, she must save her mother before such and such happens. Don't use phrases like, can they this or that, before it's too late, or before time runs out, or things will never be the same, or the world hangs in the balance. You shouldn't be using these generic, unspecific phrases that you're going to insert this fake drama into the last sentence of your query to try to get us to get drawn in, because it usually doesn't work. We usually think that the answer is probably yes, and as I said, that's not exciting. So find a way to tell us what your characters are up against without using those cheap tricks. Here's something I didn't see too much of, but I saw it often enough that I want to mention it. Sometimes I would see cursing in a query letter. I recommend leaving the swear words out of your query letter, because ultimately, even if your book does contain that kind of language, contains vulgarity, contains violence, contains adult situations, the query letter is a business letter. So try to keep it professional, and there are still ways to indicate that the content is very adult without actually using the swear words in the query. Another one I saw too much of was giving too many character names in the query. You're going to, of course, want to mention the protagonist's name, and if they have a love interest, if they have an antagonist, if they have any supporting characters that are very relevant to the plot, but it's really not necessary to go through like a roll call of everybody in the adventuring party or everybody in the school. So mention the important people, and don't go into too much detail about the rest of the cast in a query. Another do not, telling the ending in a query letter. I did see this now and then, and I think that it may be because some people are reading instructions on how to write a synopsis, and they're getting it confused with the type of synopsis that you include in the query letter. So let me get this straight. Sometimes agents will ask you to query and include a synopsis, and then the synopsis, when you look up online how do I write a synopsis, it says that you have to tell all the plot points, and that includes the ending. That is true if it's a separate synopsis that they're asking for you to tell them everything that happens in the story. But in a query letter, that's not how you pitch it. The query letter is a pitch statement. It's very much like the back of a book, and you don't tell the ending on the back of a book. So you want to tell the audience, you want to tell the agent what kind of plot that we might be looking at, what the major problems are, but you don't want to tell them how it ends. So don't spoil your story in the query. Here's one that was really common, is authors insisting on telling me the messages of their book, or the themes, or what kind of lessons that it teaches, divorced from story. You don't want to go into those kinds of things. Those sorts of elements are going to be self-evident when you see the overarching parts of the plot and you start to read the story. Don't tell the agent what they're going to learn from it, or how inspirational it is, or how it's going to help people, or that it's has great messages about friendship or something like that. Those are not the types of things that you want to say in a query letter. You also don't want to say too many things that sound like you're complimenting yourself, like calling your book revolutionary or unique, or any of those things that make it seem like a marketing statement. You should leave the value statements to the people reviewing your book. And you really don't need to promise that it contains any kind of special elements, or that they're going to have any special reaction to it. That should all be self-evident, and that should be up to us. So what you do is you run the risk of sounding pretentious or sounding arrogant if you include these in a query letter. And lastly, something that I saw too much of was too much setup in the beginning. Some of the queries that I had to look at spent like an entire paragraph setting up what the character's life was like before the plot happened, or giving us a whole background on how a country got into the war that the story is about. So you really don't need to give us all of the background. Just start where the story starts, and even if that background is really important for understanding why this plot is happening in the first place, the query is not where you want us to have full understanding of all of the context of your story. Just trust us, and hope that we'll tune in for what the actual story is. And since this is an important part of querying as well, I want to talk about the bio. You're supposed to include a little bit of biographical information in your query letter, And all too often I saw authors messing this up too. So let me go into some details about what you should say and what you shouldn't say in the bio section of your query. Okay, so that query letter bio section is primarily for two purposes. One, for you to talk about your publication credits and any professional writing experience that you have. And number two, for you to explain any special connection that you have with the subject matter of the manuscript you're trying to sell to them. So, and what I mean by special connection is not like I have kids and my book is about kids. It might be about you're writing science fiction and you're actually a scientist who's studying the type of science that this book is built on. Those kinds of specific details will make people think that maybe you have an authentic or really informed understanding of this subject, and that way it'll be especially interesting or especially accurate. But other than that, you really don't need to exaggerate or overly pad this section. You don't need to list things that aren't really publication credits, if you write a lot of stuff on your blog or something like that. So make sure that your bio section isn't some kind of excuse for you to try to make a personal connection with the agent or to go on too long about anything else that is not about this project. So right here I'm going to go into some of the other things that I saw in bios too often and why you shouldn't include them. So first, I saw a lot of authors telling me who they think they write like, or maybe making comparisons to really famous works and saying that they write like this person or their book is very much like this thing. And the thing is, comp titles, comparison titles, those are fine, but you should always phrase it as it'll appeal to fans of this. You should never say like, oh, I'm the next J.K. Rowling. You should never say something like that about your own work. So, of course, you're hoping that you're going to be as famous or influential or accomplished or successful as these authors, but basically they're just not going to believe you until they read the book, so you might as well not try to make those kinds of comparisons. Another common one is authors telling me this is their first novel, and some people will probably disagree with me on this, and it probably won't kill you if you see it in the query, but the reason I recommend people don't do this is it's kind of like showing up for a job interview and saying like, I think I can do this, but this is the first time I've tried. Like, why would you want to undermine the confidence that they might have in you? Most authors who manage to get representation for their books or sell a book, it's probably not the first novel that they've written. So that's of course not always the case, but there's just nothing really to gain from telling the agent that this is your first novel unless it's retroactively after they offer you representation, and then hey, they can be impressed, but it doesn't really, it certainly doesn't help you, and it's also not necessary to use that in place of publication credits. They're not going to care if you don't have any, because it really is about the manuscript, but they do like to know if you have publication credits. It's just, it's not necessary, so you don't need to substitute, this is my first book, for not having publication credits or to try to explain it. Okay, here's one I saw every once in a while was authors who had been self-published or published by very small presses who are now looking to make it in the mainstream. They would tell me how their previous books did on Amazon or got reviewed by a nobody or something like that. We want to see any kind of publication, even if it's self-pub or small pub, in your list of publication credits if you have that, but you don't need to give us assurances of how your other projects were received, or basically it'll make you look like you're reaching, and it also distracts from this project. You need to focus on this project. So don't tell us about those. Don't go into detail about what they're about. Don't tell us about all the other ones that you've written that you haven't done anything with. Focus on this project and don't really talk about how these other things were received. I guess the exception though would be, if you did get a professional review from somebody like Publishers Weekly or something like that for a previous book. Professional reviews are okay to quote, be really brief about it, but this should not take up much space in your query. Another thing you shouldn't do, don't talk about rejections. I don't know why authors do this, but I saw it a bunch of times that authors would tell me that it's already been rejected a bunch of times, or I think that they're maybe trying for self-deprecating humor or something like that, or trying to look the opposite of arrogant, but don't talk about all the times you failed. It's really not going to help you very much, and it's probably going to reflect poorly on you. Here's another one I saw too often, and I don't know why authors are doing this, but they tell me why they wrote the book, or they give me details about what inspired them to write it, and that's the kind of stuff we really, really don't want to see in a query. We don't need a backstory about what inspired you to write it, and we don't need an explanation about what you think it is going to accomplish. So we really don't need the story of how the book came to be or why you're personally trying to accomplish something with the text. So I recommend leaving out any kind of personal details about what led you to write it. And of course the exception to that would be if you're writing a nonfiction book that is primarily based on your life or about your experiences with something that you're trying to write a self-help book about something that you've personally overcome. But that's very different from pitching a novel, and it doesn't belong in a pitch statement in a query letter. Okay, and something that I saw once or twice, primarily in my own genre of choice, science fiction, fantasy, I would occasionally see an author trying to break away from the story to explain special rules in their magic system or their fantasy history or something. They'd spend like a paragraph on this explaining stuff to me, and that is definitely something that doesn't belong in a query either. So if you have special circumstances that we need to understand something that's going on in the story, you really need to find a very brief way to give us the minimum amount of context we need before the story starts. There should not be these special asides explaining your neat concepts or stuff that you think is going to make us think, wow, that's unique, because it really doesn't. It makes us think you don't really know how to naturally reveal these details to a reader. And then finally, don't include stuff that's about the publishing or writing or editing process. We don't need to know that you hired an editor. We expect it to be edited, regardless of whether you paid somebody to do it or if you did it with yourself and your critique partners. We don't need to know how long you've been submitting to agents. We don't need to know, again, about the rejections. We don't need to know about how many revisions you've done. We don't need to know how long it took you to write. So don't include these kinds of details into your query letter. I think some authors think that makes them look more dedicated or makes them look really serious, but the fact is we expect you to be serious at this point. We expect you to have done all your homework, and we don't need to see your work. And of course, this is something that I never personally saw, thank goodness, but I've heard agents complain about it, so I'm going to tell you too. Don't promise anything. I have seen tons of agents claiming that writers are writing to them, telling them this is going to be a bestseller, this is going to sell X million copies, this is going to make you rich. These are usually followed by, if the agent rejects it, they're like, oh, you don't know what you're missing. These people are out of touch with reality and with how publishing works. And you don't want to be the person who's making these wild promises about anything. Don't mention movie deals, don't mention that you think it's perfect for such and such giant publisher. That's not necessary, and it's actually very arrogant. So the agent is probably going to think, even if they like your book, they're probably going to think you have unrealistic expectations and that you're probably going to be a nightmare to work with. So don't say that sort of thing in your queries. So that's going to wrap up my query do nots based on my experience doing pitch wars. And I did get to review most of these writers' first chapter samples as well. And I'm happy to say that for the most part their writing was usually better than the query. But what you have to know is a lot of agents won't go past the query if they think that the query is awful or you make one of these mistakes. So your query really does have to be an advertising statement. It has to do what it was written to do, or they may never make it to your pages, and the pages may not be able to save it. So ultimately, it really is about whether you can write a good story, and querying is a separate skill that some of us aren't as good at as we are at writing stories, and there's no harm in admitting that, but you still have to be able to get good enough at writing these kinds of business letters to be able to get in the door. So there's all kinds of stuff that I could say about mistakes people made in their opening pages as well, but I will have to cover that at a different time. And actually, I think some of my other videos have gone into openings and things that you should try to avoid in your opening pages, so you may look those up, because that can just as easily turn off an agent who was initially reeled in by your query. So if you have any questions for any clarification on any of these points that I say do not do, or whether any of your own things that you've done are exceptions to this, then let me know. And again, I should specify that I don't have extra time to review people's queries individually, but I can answer individual questions about querying if it's in the general. So I hope that this helps people and gives you some perspective on what some of us are going to be looking for when we look at query letters, even though I'm not an agent. I've seen so many query letters in these contests now that I feel like I know something about what they go through and what makes me say no to something. So hopefully that will give you a better perspective on it, and you guys will be another step closer to getting signed. Good luck.